Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, final moves by the Biden administration before its exit, how they could undermine Israel's standing on the world stage. Plus, a wide-ranging conversation with Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell and CBN President Gordon Robertson on the fast-changing Middle East and what could lie ahead. And a new documentary explores the ideology behind the October 7th attacks. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Julie Stahl. The Biden administration in its final days may be trying to use the UN to pull the rug out from under Israel, while Secretary of State Blinken blames Hamas for the war in Gaza and wonders why the world doesn't do the same. Here's the story, followed by an extended interview with our Jerusalem Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell and CBN President Gordon Robertson. In its final days, the Biden administration is said to be considering a new anti-Israel resolution in the UN Security Council that would undermine President-elect Trump's Middle East policy. Michael Doran, co-host of the Hudson Institute's Israel Update podcast, describes how the resolution might happen.
There will be an official finding by the State Department that Israel is in violation of 620I. It's blocking humanitarian aid to Gaza.
The Security Council would then take that finding as evidence it needs to pass a new resolution punishing Israel. The U.S. would reportedly abstain in the vote on the resolution so it would pass, and then the world bodies like the International Criminal Court would use it to condemn and weaken Israel.
This resolution and the American official finding will be used by the ICJ, the ICC, etc., against Israel.
What we're looking at here is fear that they'll use these 18 days to undermine Trump and his ability to move forward with his own Middle East policy and to further damage Israel's standing in the international arena.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken is now admitting that the Biden administration's pressure on Israel has emboldened Hamas. He told the New York Times that every time Hamas saw the U.S. squeeze Israel, the terror group backed off from a hostage deal.
Whenever there has been public daylight between the United States and Israel and the perception that pressure was growing on Israel, we've seen it. Hamas has pulled back from agreeing to a ceasefire and the release of hostages.
Negotiations for a ceasefire and hostage release are moving slowly. Hamas has reportedly agreed to release 34 hostages, but the terror group is demanding a week-long ceasefire so it can determine which ones are still alive and how many are dead. This weekend, the terror group released a video of IDF soldier Liri Albag, held hostage in Gaza now almost 460 days. Her parents talked to top Israeli leaders after the video came out.
And we told them to make a deal. This is the time. There's Liri and 99 other hostages who need to return home quickly.
They also told Israel's Channel 12 News the video released today ripped our hearts to shreds, and they asked it not be made public. In his interview with The Times, Blinken said Hamas is responsible for the hostages' continued captivity and questions why world leaders aren't putting more pressure on the terror group.
For all of the understandable criticism of the way Israel has conducted itself in Gaza, you hear virtually nothing from anyone since October 7th about Hamas. Why there hasn't been a unanimous chorus around the world for Hamas to put down its weapons, to give up the hostages, to surrender. I don't know what the answer is to that.
Meanwhile, the war continues on other fronts. On Monday in Samaria, also known as the West Bank, terrorists fired on an Israeli bus, killing 3 Israelis and wounding 9 others.
Well, our CBN Middle East Bureau Chief, Chris Mitchell, is in the United States, and he's with us right now on set. So, Chris, I've got to piggyback on what our Secretary of State just said. He said it's understandable to criticize Israel in the conduct of the war. I'm listening to that, and I'm going, you've got to be kidding me. Yeah. What in the world is he talking about?
Well, what Israel has done in the prosecution of the war, according to John Spencer, military historian, Israel has done more than any other military in modern history to protect civilian lives. And also talking about this finding about humanitarian aid, they have provided hundreds of thousands of tons of food, medical supplies into Gaza that actually has been used by Hamas to fight their war by selling it on the black market, getting food, and using it as a leverage against their own people, the Palestinian people.
I assume Blinken understands that the same critique could be made against U.S. soldiers in how they went to war with Iraq or went to war with Afghanistan, that the same things happen in a battle zone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that was the point that Israel's been making since the beginning of the war. You know, they lament all the Palestinian casualties, but they're doing everything they can. They tell Palestinians to get out of harm's way. They tell them where they're going to attack, get to a humanitarian zone and get out. So this telegraphs to Hamas exactly what Israel's going to do. And so this actually puts not only Palestinian lives at risk, but also Israeli soldiers. And that's something that I've heard from Israelis, that they're just concerned what the U.S. has been doing, pressuring Israel, is putting their own soldiers at risk and throughout the prosecution of the war.
Well, let's also talk about, you know, when there's, to use Blinken's term, when there's daylight between Israel and the United States, where it appears publicly that there's some disagreement with them as to what to do. That actually emboldens Hamas and stops any kind of negotiation and release of hostages. And they say, well, okay, if we just hold on and continue this, we can isolate Israel.
Well, that's exactly part of Hamas's strategy. And much of the public daylight has come from the U.S. side. That's how many people in Israel perceive it, that the Biden administration has really been putting pressure on Israel. They've actually started to undermine or started to undermine the Biden administration. You saw that Senate Majority Leader at one time, with the White House permission, asked for a change of leadership. So the public daylight had been coming from the Biden administration in many ways and fit into Sinwar, the leader of Hamas's strategy. It was actually discovered in some of their documents that they wanted to divide not only the Israeli public, and they used the hostages to do that, but also between Israel and the United States.
And Israel and the world and Europe and UN. I mean, the list goes on. It's all part of the grander strategy. They were hoping Hezbollah would come in force. They were hoping Syria would come in. They were hoping Iran would come in. And they were trying to ignite the entire Middle East. Let's talk about an obscure thing. It's called 620I. What exactly is that, and how? I mean, I hear loud and clear Carolyn Glick in that piece, but others are saying, Israel, watch out. There's about to be a Biden surprise, somewhat similar to what Obama did in his last month in office. Yeah,
that was Resolution 2334, which actually said that all Israeli, quote-unquote, settlements were illegal, and that would include Jewish Quarter,
the Jewish Quarter,
the Temple Mount, the Western Wall. So this finding is that if anybody is found keeping humanitarian aid away, the U.S. can limit military aid to that country, and that would be Israel. So the finding would actually be brought reportedly before the UN Security Council. The U.S. may abstain, just like they did in 2016, which would open the door for criticism, demonization of Israel, and from the International Criminal Court to the International Court of Justice. And one of the keys, Gordon, I think, is whether or not it would be under Article 6 or 7 under the UN Charter. Article 6 is that, the anti-resolution would go against Israel. However, Article 7 carries the weight of actually force and sanctions. So that would be critical in case this ever does get to the UN Security Council.
It seems to be a duality in U.S. foreign policy. On the one hand, let's take 620I and try to demonize Israel, saying you're withholding humanitarian aid from Gaza. And so therefore, we're now going to withhold aid from you. At the same time, he just said $8 billion in weapons going to Israel. So the U.S. is not going to act on the finding at all. It's not going to change anything in our behavior to Israel.
Coming up, are U.S. policies and media coverage sending mixed messages about Israel?
I've got to ask the larger question. Why in the world would you want to put Israel at a disadvantage at the UN?
Yeah, it's a question I think a lot of people have asked. Why has the Biden administration been against Israel? I think they've had a sort of a schizophrenic policy towards Israel since October 7th. On the one hand, they want to support Israel publicly. On the other hand, there's a limited arms embargo. There's statements that Israel is not prosecuting the war and not providing humanitarian aid. And if you look at the way that Israel has provided humanitarian aid, they've provided hundreds of thousands of tons of food into the Palestinian people, really against their own, which actually many people believe, and military experts say, that actually lengthened the war, that actually put Israeli lives more at risk and the Palestinian lives, and lengthened what has been the Israel's longest war in its history.
It's also against U.S. interests because U.S. citizens are hostages.
That's right. That's right.
And so, again, I'm puzzled. Why in the world would you do this? It literally makes no sense.
Yeah.
You're not even representing your own country anymore.
Yeah, I remember a few weeks ago, Gordon, you asked actually us in the Jerusalem Bureau to have the names and the faces of all the 8 Israeli-American hostages. And I think throughout the prosecution of this war, the fact that there are Americans there almost 460 days now in captivity, it's kind of been lost, I think, on the American public. I think that's a reflection on the Biden administration not making it clear that there are Americans involved, Americans in hostages, maybe in some tunnel in Gaza right now. So that seems to be part of this lack, I think, of resolve to make sure that Americans would be safe. I would expect, based on what President-elect Trump has done in 2016 to 2020, they're going to be a focus in this new administration of those Americans.
I've got to say, isn't it also an indictment of American media? You know, I remember the Iranian hostage, and so the Iranian government took our embassy personnel, held them hostage. And a whole nightly news program came out of it.
Began that way.
I mean, so there was a steady drumbeat. And then during the Bush administration, every single broadcast, every news broadcast started or ended with how many American soldiers had died in the war in Iraq. And that was the lead up to the 2008 election. If there had been anybody other than Biden in office, would the American media have changed the narrative on the hostages held by Hamas?
Yeah, you would think so. And like you say, you refer to Nightline. Ted Koppel, famously, that's how his show began about the Iranian hostages. I think that would have made a huge difference if people knew day by day, week by week, that Americans were being held hostage within and it would make a change, I think, on the blame being on Hamas, not Israel, during this war.
I don't want to get too political with it because Carter was a Democrat and so Bush was a Republican, and it just seems the narrative has changed. But let's look at administration policy. Carter, after he left office, seemed to be increasingly against Israel.
Very much so.
Clinton, I have to give him credit. He was very pro-Israel, and when he proposed to Arafat a Palestinian state, and that was rejected, he's been very consistent in the past 2 years to say, look at what they rejected. And that should open your eyes as to what their ultimate goals are. They had it all. They could have had a Palestinian state. They could have had East Jerusalem. They could have had all of that, and they turned it down. But then you get Obama, and now you have Biden, and it seems to be a very anti-Israel and even setups at the UN in order to demonize the state of Israel. I've got to ask, why? Why would you do that to an ally?
It seems like there's an element, and I think there's, as we talked about, a schizophrenic policies, perhaps from the White House or the State Department. Reportedly, there are people that are opposing this potential UN resolution. It seems to be probably an element, perhaps, of anti-Semitism, an anti-Israel focus that they want to somehow, maybe at the very last minute, give it to Israel and make it harder for the Trump administration coming in and to demonize Israel in the light of the World Forum.
Still ahead, shifting alliances and the possibility of a victory for Israel.
What's Israel expecting Trump to do?
Well, first of all, I think the big thing they'll be expecting is Iran. Right now, it seems like more than ever that Iran is weakened. And I remember for years, your father, Pat, used to ask me, is Israel going to do it? Are they going to attack? I think it's more likely now than ever before for a couple of reasons. First of all, Iran's anti-air defense system is down. And now Syria's air defenses have been destroyed by Israel. So the way forward militarily looks good. In terms of weakened Iran, Hamas has been defeated, Hezbollah, the Houthis are weakened as well. And it seems like internally, they're really on the back foot. And it might be the time for the Trump administration at least to give the green light, if not actually help Israel go ahead and destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. And that could lead to a regime change because there's so much opposition within the country itself against the mullahs after 40 years plus of this tyranny.
Are we on the verge of an historic victory? I mean, I see Hezbollah has been dismantled. Hamas is on its last legs. Syria has changed. I'm worried about the new government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm worried that they're radically oriented. They have said they want to conquer Israel and conquer Jerusalem. But if Iran, is this an incredibly, historic victory?
If you look at what happened from October 7th to today, I think people would call it a miracle. Hamas has been defeated almost totally. Hezbollah as well, which was the main nemesis on Israel's border. And now Iran itself may fall. People, I think, would say they couldn't believe how bad it was on October 7th to today. I think it could be considered miraculous. And as you said about Syria, that may be the next big threat on the horizon, and Turkey as well. And in terms of Syria, I think it's important to pray for Christians right now who are perhaps increasingly under the threat of Sharia law there in Syria.
It's going to be ISIS in Iraq all over again. They're going to go after the religious minorities, whether they're Christian or Druze. Or they're going to act just like ISIS acted in northern Iraq.
I think people need to realize that's what's coming. They're talking a good game right now, but the way they're acting on the ground. Give you one example. There in Aleppo, they're asking for Christian women to wear the hijab. I think that's a portent of things to come.
Spiritually, you're a watchman on the wall. What's God telling you?
I think that there's historic changes going on in the Middle East. Nations are shifting. If you look at what Jesus said about nations rising up against nations, we're seeing that in the Middle East. We're seeing the rise of Turkey. We're seeing the fall, perhaps, of Iran, at least temporarily. I think also in Israel, I see people more turning to God, an increased faith in God since October 7th. And I think we are looking on the cusp of even greater changes, perhaps, than what we've seen in the last 14, 15 months.
And you'll be on the front lines reporting all of it. Chris, thanks for being with us.
Up next, Examining the Horror, a new documentary looks at the ideology that led to the events of October 7th. As more time passes after October 7th, there's an opportunity to see it within a greater historic and cultural context. CBN senior correspondent Gary Lane interviewed a French documentarian on his new film, Pogroms, which attempts to do just that. Take a look.
The October 7th terrorist attack in Israel was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It led to war and the loss of thousands of lives in Gaza, and now war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. 1 year after the Hamas terror bloodbath against Israel, its impact is still being felt, not only in the Middle East, but around the world. Joining us is French-Israeli award-winning filmmaker Pierre Rehov. His latest documentary out this week is called Pogroms. Pierre, bonjour, bienvenue, shalom. You've done a lot of films about Israel and the Middle East over the years, so as an Israeli, I'm sure this one was a bit more personal for you. Why did you feel compelled to do a film about October 7th?
Well, first of all, I live about 20 miles north of Gaza, and on October 7th at 6:30, I was woken up by like everybody else in Israel by sirens. I received a phone call at about 7 a.m. from a friend of mine who told me, lock your doors, lock your windows, we are invading. That's how I found out that something big was happening. And since then, we've been where I live under Hamas rocket for about 3 to 4 months before the IDF was capable of to stop the firing of rockets, at least in my specific region. But it took me a couple, 3 months to finally decide to make a film about it, because October 7 was a tragedy. It was a massacre. It was a pogrom. It was a kind of a genocide. But on October the 8th, the next day, instead of seeing people with a T-shirt in the street of New York or Los Angeles saying, I am Israel, stop Hamas, no, they did exactly the opposite. And a lot of students in many universities around the planet and people in the streets started rioting, not on the side of Israel, but exactly on the opposite side, taking the side of the Hamas.
I have viewed the film. I must admit the graphic video and images and the testimonies of the first responders were difficult to bear. What impact did all of it have on you?
What you saw is not 0.5% of what I saw. And I selected among the images that I had to see the mildest. I watched and I saw videos that even in the worst horror films made by Hollywood, you wouldn't dare putting the images off, because I met with many first responders. And, you know, in Israel, there is a high level of respect for the dead. So the government try as much as possible to not let those images of dead Israelis travel around the planet. So many, I would say 90% of them were censored, taken down from the social networks. But first of all, I got material from the army, and I got also material, I saw material from the cell phones of the first responders who filmed what they saw, who filmed what they discovered. And this is something that I don't even want to describe, but it got me a few nightmares. And even today, months after, I cannot still believe that things like that happen. It's like a nightmare written by Ted Bundy. And actually, we had like 6,000 Ted Bundys going inside Israel to massacre Jews.
Well, after detailing the October 7th massacre, you explore the ideology that led up to this horrific crime, the creation of Hamas as a military wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, funding and support from Iran and Qatar. But you also mentioned that no such thing as a Palestinian nation or people existed. A nationalist movement was actually triggered by global powers, and the Soviet Union was the first one. Tell us more about that.
Every historian who has been really looking in good faith at the events and at the history itself knows that the Palestinian people were invented by Yasser Arafat, Nasser, the president of Egypt, and the KGB in 1964. The reason for this invention at a period of time when people were not talking so much about Israel and the Arabs living in Palestine, who didn't call themselves Palestinians in those days, because Palestine was only a region, never been a country, never been a kingdom, never been anything but a region. And the only thing which was in this place as an independent country throughout history was Judea, Samaria, the Kingdom of Israel, and now Israel itself. So in 1964, Nasser was having trouble with putting together all the Arab countries under his personal domination, and he wanted to give it another try. When Yasser Arafat came to him and said, Yasser Arafat, who was born in Egypt, has never been a Palestinian himself, and came up with this terrific idea, let's make the world turn against Israel. Palestinians never wanted a country. They had a plan to destroy Israel for ideological reasons, because a Muslim cannot accept that another Muslim would live under Jewish rule. Today, after October 7, after receiving thousands of rockets, after having had all those murders, those tortures, those rapes, inside Israel, and having now the Hezbollah and Iran attacking us for such a long time, Israel said enough.
Pierre Rehoff, merci beaucoup. Tuda Rabah, thank you for being with us. Shana Tova.
Thank you very much.
That's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. And please keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem and for the release of the hostages held in Gaza. Remember, the God who watches over Israel and you and me neither slumbers nor sleeps. I'm Julie Stahl. For all of us here at the Jerusalem Bureau, we'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.